are going to turn it over now to our final speaker for the day, Twan Leenders. And many of you have attended, I'm sure, some of Twan's presentations that he has done at past GROW Fair events, among many other presentations that he's done with his role with RTPI and his wider career. So we are absolutely thrilled to have you here today, Twan. And Twan's going to speak about birds and how we can support them. And we're super excited. So thank you for being here, Twan.
Excellent. Thank you all for having me on this beautiful day where you could be bird watching or gardening, I guess. All right, let me see if I can get this going here. Can you see that?
Yes, you're good to go.
Excellent. And you can hear me too because I'm wearing my headphones so my dog doesn't take over my talk.
Yep, you're good. We can hear you good. So
excellent. Well, thank you all for having me here this afternoon. It's a glorious day. Great to see that there's a good turnout for this program here, which is fantastic. It's not quite the same as seeing everybody in person, but I'm still excited that people are coming out. And I wanted to share a little bit of information with you all about birds in our backyards, what we can do with birds, how birds sort of connect to our greater ecosystem and everything that comes with it. And you know, there are a lot of birds, so I thought maybe I can try to do this relatively quickly so we'll have some time for questions, because obviously I cannot cover everything that I would love to cover here. But we'll see how far we get. So birds in our backyard. I wanted to start with, you know, how can I not, a quote from our famous Jamestown resident, Roger Tory Peterson. Birds are sensitive indicators of the environment. They're a sort of ecological litmus paper. The observation and recording of bird populations over time lead inevitably to environmental awareness and can signal impending changes. So Roger Tory Peterson was probably the premier bird watcher of his time. He definitely was actually that. And but he was much more than that. He watched birds. He loved birds. He really took note of what was happening around him wherever he was. And I kind of always see him as sort of one of the premier citizen scientists, because he didn't have a scientific training, but he had a passion for birds, a passion for the environment, and he always was able to kind of read the landscape and what was happening in the environment based on how birds were doing. So I kind of want to take that concept and just kind of talk a little bit about how that sort of translates into our backyard scenario. So you probably all know that this is a northern cardinal. I'll give you one more little Roger Tory Peterson anecdote. So Roger graduated from Jamestown High School, age 16. He was born in 1908, so that puts him sort of graduating in 1924 by the time he left Jamestown. The story goes that while he was still in Jamestown, so before 1924, Roger was already smitten with birds and saw a lot of them in his backyard, just stomping around the greater Jamestown area. But one of the very few birds that he ever went far out of his way for to see, the very first one that was within travelable distance, whatever that meant at the time, you know, a significant range outside of Jamestown, was the northern cardinal. So in 1924, or before 1924, cardinals were not here. That's maybe hard to imagine because they're just everywhere right now, but they're kind of indicative of what's going on in our environment. So apart from the cardinal, which is really sort of an established bird right now, we have several other birds that are recent arrivals here. Carolina wren, red-bellied woodpecker, that bird on the left, titmouse, eastern tufted titmouse. Those are birds that you don't blanket see everywhere here. They're here. I have them in my backyard, but I don't see them everywhere because they're right on the edge of the range of these birds. These are mostly southern birds that are gradually moving northward because our environment is changing, and primarily it's getting warmer. Now, being in an urban environment, cities tend to be sort of heat bubbles. You know, all the paved surfaces, the concrete, the blacktop, it tends to be such that cities with all their paved surfaces tend to be a few degrees warmer than the surrounding areas, especially if those are forested areas, because trees, we all know, really cool the environment down. So cities have become sort of this little warm pockets, hot pockets, if you will, in an otherwise relatively colder area. and are providing homes for birds that are otherwise historically only found south of us. The next bird that's coming in, a Carolina chickadee, is probably within 40 or 50 miles of us right now. So there's a second chickadee species that is moving closer and closer. And I just wanted to share this with you just to give you an idea of how our environment has been changing over the last 100 or so years, and how that impacts our backyards, how it impacts our birds, how it impacts not just the birds, but you see other species are doing the same thing. We're starting to see more and more southern species coming in. So at the risk of depressing you all terribly on this beautiful day, I do feel like I need to share some context here. So things are changing for birds, and how are they changing? Well, the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology recently put out a study that shows that since the 1970s, or actually since 1970, we've lost almost 30% of our birds, which is absolutely staggering when you think about that. And they put a number on that: 2.9 billion birds gone in 50 years. So there's a lot of things that could be debated about this study. But the bottom line is that birds are declining across the board, and they're declining really fast. We're talking about a span of 50 years, and we're losing, 1 in 4 birds. And, certain habitats are more likely to decline their bird fauna, especially grassland birds have been hit really hard. There's this kind of a residue of, the loss of our prairie habitat, our grassland habitat, the natural grasslands. A lot of current hayfields, for example, still serve as a grassland and still function for birds, but the way those are being managed with really intensive haying, 3-4 cuts a year, guaranteed you're going to have a cut somewhere during a breeding season. So even though we still see a lot of native grassland birds in agricultural hayfields, for example, these birds are often not able to reproduce because the young get hurt or killed during one of the harvests, the second or the third cutting usually. So grassland birds have really taken a nosedive in the last couple of decades, and more than half of them are gone. Shorebirds are really hurting because the beaches are being impacted by development. Boreal forest birds are hurting because of climate change, et cetera, et cetera. So, it's not across the board as bad for all birds, but the overall trend is not great. So Ken Rosenberg, who's a conservation scientist at Cornell Lab of Ornithology, he was one of the lead authors on this study. He said that these bird losses are really a strong signal that our human-altered landscapes are losing their ability to support bird life. Now, that is quite a statement, and probably very true. I would say that a lot of these losses are attributed to human impacts, direct or indirect. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit more, because this is true, but it's also true that humans can do something to reverse that trend. And that's really what I wanted to talk about. So in spite of these tragic losses, what does that kind of mean for our backyard? Here's just a graphic from that same study. So since in the last 50 years, we've lost about 1 in 4 blue jays, grosbeaks, same kind of thing. Juncos 1 in 3, sparrows, orioles 1 in 3. Those are staggering numbers, but these are birds that, as you kind of see in the graphic already, are relying on our backyards, and they're relying on features that exist in our backyards. So what can we do? So there's several major factors at play that are driving this decline in bird species. There's several things that could be done to make a change here. And I listed them all. There's a lot of letters on this slide right here. I'm not going to read it all out, but there's a couple of obvious factors that seem to have the biggest impact on bird populations. A lot of birds collide with windows. So making your windows more visible to birds by putting decals on there, stickers, plants in front of them, curtains. Those are the kind of things that are simple things you can do that can avoid bird collisions, because it's a real factor. And the estimates are that as many as 1 billion birds a year die from striking a window somewhere during migration, or even just when a bird feeder is put too close to your living room window so that you can see the feeders. If a raptor, if a hawk swoops in on the feeders and the birds spook, often they go for the darkest place they can see. So if your lights are not on inside your house, they might think they can duck through a dark square hole in your wall and not realizing that there's a window there. So putting decals on your windows is a huge, big help and an easy thing to do. I hate to say this, and it's a very controversial topic, but probably one of the biggest drivers of bird declines outside of the sort of overarching habitat loss factor is outdoor cats. Outdoor cats kill tremendous numbers of birds. Um, and it is tragic. It's absolutely tragic. It is not good for cats to be outdoors all the time. They pick up diseases, ticks, they get in fights with raccoons and other animals. So outdoor cats generally don't have a very good life, and they're doing a tremendous amount of damage. You know, I personally don't own a cat, but I do have bird feeders in my backyard, and I know there's at least 3 stray cats that show up in my bird feeders all the time. So on the one hand, you're trying to promote birds, and it's almost like my bird feeders are becoming cat feeders sometimes. So, you know, this is a really tough topic to tackle, but it's definitely something that we need to address at some point. Reducing lawn and plant natives, we'll talk about that more. Avoiding pesticides seems like a no-brainer. We'll talk about that a little bit more too. Drinking shade-grown coffee. Now, I'm a big coffee drinker, so I'm all in favor of this, but this is a factor that a lot of people don't realize, that your coffee comes from agricultural style coffee plantations, which are monocultures of coffee plains, which is not habitat that's suitable for birds. So these coffee plantations tend to be in the tropics. Rainforest is often removed to make those plantations. So you're removing habitat from birds and replacing it with unsuitable habitat. So shade-grown coffee refers to the fact that some of these plantations actually have shade trees in there. So it's almost like you're growing coffee inside sort of an adapted forest. It's not quite the same as the forest that was there to begin with, but it's still nowhere near as bad for these birds than having just an outright coffee plantation with no shade trees at all. So promoting shade-grown coffee, drinking and buying more shade-grown coffee, which granted is usually a little bit more expensive than the regular coffee, actually directly helps protecting birds. And that's a really interesting factor that most people are not aware of. Obviously, reducing plastics, because birds eat it and get tangled in it, not great. And the last one I just kind of want to stress too, that watching birds and sharing what you see is really important, because this is what gets people excited about the kind of things that you can see in your backyard. And I'm hoping that you'll take a little bit of that away from this talk too. So again, I'm not going to go into all these controversial topics here, but this is the one thing I would like to dig in a little bit deeper here. Reducing our lawn and planting native plants so that they can provide shelter, food, and nesting habitat for birds. All things that lawn does not. So I always kind of call this birdscaping. Birdscaping your yard. What can you do in your yard so that birds are more at home there? Now, when you think about this, if you look out your window and you have a lawn, or if you're just driving through the city and you see a strip of turf grass somewhere, the birds that you're most likely going to see there are, you might see some crows walking around. Robins are usually there pulling worms up. Starlings don't seem to mind being on there, and Canada geese love lawn. Canada geese love lawn because they can eat it. It roots really shallowly, so they can pull it right up and munch on it. And much to the chagrin of most people who really like lawn, Canada geese are like the bane of their existence. People call me all the time because they want to get rid of their Canada geese in the yard. They don't know what to do. Nothing seems to stop them. And there's one very, very simple solution. You just stop mowing. If you let your grass grow to about 6 inches or so, 5-6 inches, geese hate it. This goose in the picture right there, it's kind of on the verge. The grass is just deep enough that it tickles its belly, and then at that point they don't like it anymore. So if you make the grass grow just tall enough that they can't really walk in there very easily anymore, then they won't even walk on it anymore. It's that easy. And these other birds that I mentioned don't particularly like the lawn. They just like the fact that it has really easy access to the things that live in there, like little grubs and worms. So robins, you'll see them pulling worms out of the lawn all the time. They don't care that they're on a lawn. They just care that they're on a place where it's easy to get to the worms. So you can replace your lawn with some other low-growing plants, and the robins and the starlings will still be there. You may not necessarily want the starlings because they're not a native species, but there really aren't any birds that enjoy lawn. So lawn, not good for birds. Birds need real plants. They need plants that provide food. They need plants that provide shelter where they can hide from predators. They hide from the elements when it gets windy, rainy, or snowy, and they need places to build nests. And talking about food, plants provide seeds and fruits and flowers that birds eat directly, but a very important function of plants too is that they provide insects. So you can roughly divide birds up into seed eaters, plant eaters, vegetarians, if you will, and insect eaters, the carnivores. And most of the insect-eating birds are not here. They're not here now because we don't have a whole lot of insects this time of year. All of the birds that are migratory, that leave our area in the winter and come back in the summer, tend to be birds that survive on insects. They tend to be birds that need to move because in the winter there just is no food for them. So things like flycatchers and warblers just cannot survive here in the winter because there just is no food. Now, these bugs don't live and exist in a vacuum either. They don't exist in a vacuum, and they really don't particularly like lawn either. They really need specific plants to thrive in. And what kind of plants do they need? They need native plants. So native plants provide what native birds need, and native plants also provide what native insects need. And those native insects will then feed the birds again. Why is that? Well, these native plants have co-evolved for tens of thousands of years with these birds and these insects. So there are really tight relationships between specific pollinators, for example, that pollinate certain native plants. There's specific birds that like certain types of trees because they attract a lot of bugs. Like this picture right here has a Tennessee warbler picking up a little caterpillar from one of my apple trees. And by the way, almost all the pictures that you see are just taken in my backyard. So these are the kind of birds that you can find in your own backyard too if you have the right plants. Now, these relationships between native plants, native insects, and native birds they go far. They go back really far. And those kind of relationships do not exist. They simply do not exist between non-native plants and those same kind of insects. So non-native plants, and with that, I'll get into that a little bit more in detail. Non-native plant, which includes primarily all of the ornamental plants that you would generally buy at a garden center, for example, are plants that might look really pretty in our yards, but don't really have the same biological function as the plants that have been here for thousands of years and have evolved these relationships with the birds and the insects. And interestingly enough, also, a lot of the seeds that those non-native plants produce don't have the same nutritional value as our native species do. So they're just not as good for our birds. Just to give you a little bit of an idea, some researchers had actually studied chickadees in suburban yards recently, and this was in the mid-Atlantic states. And they were following these chickadees to see what kind of plants they were foraging on. You see your chickadees on your feeders all the time, so you kind of assume that they eat bird seed and they're seed eaters. But the bulk of the diet that chickadees eat is actually insects. You see them on the feeders in the winter mostly because there just aren't that many insects. But if people, like these researchers, follow chickadees and actually see what they're eating and where they're eating, it turns out that these chickadees were foraging, feeding on native plants 86% of the time. So only 14% of their time they're spending on non-native plants. If you have a yard that has primarily non-native plants, there could be up to 75% less biomass of caterpillars. So the sort of combined mass of all the caterpillars in your yard could be 75% less if you're using non-native plants versus native plants. It has a huge impact on the amount of food that's available for birds. And because of that, these chickadees were 60% less likely to breed in a yard just because there wasn't enough food because the non-native plants couldn't support that. And even the ones that did nest in those yards had fewer eggs, and the young were less likely, far less likely to survive. So those are pretty striking numbers to see what a difference it makes to have a yard full of native plants, or primarily native plants, versus a yard full of only ornamentals. And like I mentioned before, when birds do forage on these non-native plants, the berries of invasive species, so non-native invasive species like autumn olive, buckthorn, honeysuckles that we have, the non-native Asian honeysuckle, multiflora rose, they tend to be very low in fat. They have less than 1% fat and very high in sugar. Now, that kind of sounds like junk food right there, doesn't it? Whereas native species like Virginia creeper berries, viburnum, spicebush, and even poison ivy, which is a really critical plant for birds, even if we don't necessarily want it in our backyard, tend to be really high in fat. I heard Alexa talking about the good fat there. This is the good fat. This is the kind of nutritional content that birds need to survive a winter in Western New York, for example, or to stock up on their energy reserves so they are able to fly to South America and make it back again a few months later. So non-native plants just don't really provide that nutritional value. And it's almost like the birds are eating junk food. And of course, this is kind of a strategy that those plants have, because that means that birds have to eat more seeds to still get enough nutrition out of it. And you can imagine that these birds eating the seeds from these invasive species just eat the seeds and then poop out the seeds somewhere else again. So it helps these plants to spread and become even more widespread in their environment. So not good. Well, I mentioned invasive species, so I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, know what that means, but I just want to make sure that we kind of establish the difference here. So non-native invasive species are species that are not native to this area. But the fact that they're invasive means that they're actually invading areas and pushing out local species, native species. So these are the species that can really do damage to our ecology, that can do damage to our economics even, because a lot of these species will actually grow in areas on roadsides and such where they cause erosion and other problems. But on a biological level, these are the species that change our ecosystem to the point that we are starting to lose native species, plants and animals, and sometimes change the habitat in really dramatic ways. So you've probably all heard of garlic mustard. It's a species that's about to start popping up in our backyards and roadsides again. You know, it's one of many invasive species that we have around here. But if it gets out of control, it can take over entire forest areas. The entire understory in this picture right here, this is actually not here, but you know, I've seen areas like this not far from Chautauqua County where the entire forest understory is completely taken over by garlic mustard. Garlic mustard actually, the plants exude chemicals into the soil that change the living conditions, the growing conditions, to the point that only other garlic mustard plants will grow there. And if these plants are established for a few years, even removing the plants above ground will still have a residual chemical load that's changed the soil chemistry to the point that other plants just don't come back. So you end up with sort of a barren wasteland in your forest. And because of that, you know, these kind of effects sort of trickle through the ecosystem. The changes in soil chemistry actually change the forest soil to the point that salamanders can't live there anymore. And a lot of times, non-native earthworms, like these giant night crawlers that you see on the right here, then take over where these salamanders were. So, you know, if you've ever walked to the forest, and I really like amphibians, so I'm always looking for frogs and salamanders. If you look under a log in a healthy forest, you should be able to see little salamanders underneath these logs. But if you start seeing worms instead, and worms are not native to this part of the world, that means that your impact in your ecosystem is such that, you know, not only are the plants changing, but the plants have changed the forest to the point that even the animals there are not the same anymore. And at that point, it's really hard to go back to a healthy ecosystem again. Now, to contrast invasive species with other non-natives, you know, not every non-native species is invasive. Not every non-native species does damage to the environment. So our ornamentals, for example, tend to be non-native plants, or plants that have a native form living around here, but they're cultivars that have been bred for specific reasons, you know, pesticide resistance or growing larger flowers or whatever it might be, but they're not exactly the same as the local variants that we have, the local genetics that we have here. So they're not as well adapted to surviving around here. And like I said before, because they are not native to this area, they don't have these really intricate relationships with other animals that go back thousands of years. So they just don't provide the same kind of service to the environment here. I always kind of compare it to these pictures below. So you can have ornamental species that can be very pretty, and there's not a whole lot wrong with having those in your yard, but if that's all you have in your yard, then you just have lots of really pretty flowers, but it doesn't really function as an ecosystem that provides the same kind of resources that the birds need, for example, or the insects need. So it's like having, you know, Van Gogh's sunflowers painted. You know, it has the same kind of biological value as an ornamental plant would have, versus having like a native equivalent like these green leaf coneflowers that would have the same kind of aesthetics, but also would provide a whole lot of biological functionality as well. So how do we get here? How do we get to this point, and how bad is it really? So, you know, I already told you the depressing fact that these bird numbers have declined so much. Let me just throw a few more numbers at you. So at this point in time, actually this was a few years ago, 5% of the total surface area of the United States is covered by urban and other built-up areas. So, this is beautiful downtown Jamestown. Looks like a picture from a few years ago, but frankly still there. But look at the amount of pavement, and look at all the green that you can see is either just turf grass and lawn or ornamental. So, you might instinctively understand that concrete and blacktop have no biological functioning really for the animals that would like to live here, or even plants that would like to live there. But the reality is that even the plants that you see, most of these are not native here and have just about the same value as concrete or blacktop, which is not great. And because of that, people don't even know what nature is supposed to look like anymore. We're so disconnected from seeing healthy forests and healthy environments and seeing our actual native plants surrounding us that we don't really quite see what we're missing anymore. Like at this point in time, over 80% of us live in cities in artificial environments that, in just a day-to-day passing seem to function just fine. The cars make it through, we manage to get to work or to school, we get to go to grocery stores and get what we need. So it feels like these cities, these city environments function. And they function for us because we can adapt to it, but they certainly don't function for native plants and for the native insects and the native birds that rely on that. And we've gotten ourselves to the point too that anything that lives outside of the city is so strange and foreign to us that we start developing all these irrational fears about what might be out there. If you look at news coverage and social media, it's so sensationalized. Everybody's afraid of coyotes and wolves and bears and rattlesnakes that live out in the woods. And if you go out there, certainly bad things will happen to you. But at the same time, none of us will ever think twice about crossing a street knowing that there's all these fast-moving cars surrounding us that are far more dangerous than most of the things that are still actually outside of the city here. So it's hard. It's hard to get people to get used and comfortable to nature again. And it's hard to get people to nature. A lot of people just don't have the means to go leave the city and see that. So I think that's just a strong argument to really try to bring nature back into the city. And why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we replace these green strips that are completely useless right now and replace them with something that's more natural so that we can actually bring birds and other animals back in the city so that we have a more interesting environment to live in that's not just pretty but also functional. And then there's these lawns that I mentioned before that are just our enemy. They just are terrible for wildlife. And even a decade and a half ago, the lawns in the United States and Canada covered an area 3 times as large, 3 times as big as any irrigated croplands in the United States. That's staggering. That's just a third of that huge area. It's like an area roughly the size of Texas that is just biologically dead. And it doesn't have to be that. And it's not just biologically dead, but in a lot of cases, these lawns are really intensely managed. Pesticides are being applied to it, often too much or the wrong ones. Fertilizers are being applied to it just so that the grass looks perfectly green to us. But it makes it even more damaging to the environment. And a lot of these chemicals wash away during rainstorms, end up in our streams, end up in the surrounding areas that are not lawn. And so these lawns are not just biologically inert, they're biologically damaging. And again, there too, we're worried about taking our kids out of nature because we never know what might happen to them, but we seem to have no qualms about having our kids or our pets running around on lawns that even have these kind of signs on them that are clearly telling you that you shouldn't put your kids or your pets on there. So we've gotten ourselves pretty far away from a natural environment. So can we change that? Yes, absolutely. And can we change it in our backyards? Absolutely too. And do you think that your yard is too small to really make a difference? Probably, I do. But the reality is that, from what I just showed you too, that even if you can create a more natural backyard, a functional ecosystem, no matter how small it is going to be surrounded by blacktop, concrete, inert ornamentals, farmlands. It's essentially going to be surrounded by land that is even less suitable for animals and native plants than your backyard will be. So anything you can do will make a difference. It will add to the viability of our environment. And of course, if it's just your backyard, it's not all that great. But if more people started doing that, then you can have connecting pieces of backyards that in the aggregate will become a much more natural area. So this sounds really overwhelming, you know, and this is a picture of my backyard. I still have a lawn because I like to have my kids run around and kick a ball around and things like that. But every year I'm making my lawn a little bit smaller, and I just seed it with native plant seed. It looks kind of scrubby, but it grows in, and it's loaded with butterflies, and it's loaded with birds. It's fantastic. I love it. So is this an all or nothing kind of issue? Not at all. You don't have to give up all of your lawn to make a difference, nor do you have to give up on all of your ornamentals. If you really like the looks of those, keep them, that's fine. But also when you, let's say, buy an ornamental, make a point of also buying some native plants so you can add to that. So you're not just creating a yard that only looks pretty but has absolutely no biological value. And you can start small, just little patches. I just have a little patch in my yard where I just put some hardware cloth around it, some chicken wire around it, and I just started putting native plant seeds in the ground, and they just start growing. And every time I have some little seedlings, I just put them out in different parts of the yard, and little by little, these little bits and pieces start to grow together, and you start seeing more and more little better friends out there. So producing your lawn, obviously not using pesticides because that's never a good thing. Removing the invasive species that we have, that is really critical. My backyard is overrun by multiflora rose, by Asian honeysuckle, privet. There's probably another 3 or 4 other species that are just out of control. And as soon as I'm done with this talk, I'm going to go outside and pull roses again because it seems like a never-ending battle, but it isn't. It does help. You have to remove these. If you don't remove them, they grow faster than you can ever try to handle them, and they will overrun and undo all of the good that you do in your backyard. So removing your invasive species really is a first step to making sure that you get control over your backyard again. And then plant natives. As soon as you remove something, try to plant something in return that can hold its own in our climate, and that can also be pollinated by the local insects, so that you have something that has a chance of actually surviving here, and hopefully will grow fast enough to cover the ground that you just carved out of your backyard that was first taken up by invasive. So what kind of things do you want to plant? Obviously, this kind of depends on where your yard is, what your soil is like, how much space you have. I would say that anything native is better than ornamentals or invasives. So that's the easy thing there. But there are species of plants that are better than others in terms of attracting additional birds or additional insects. Now, I listed a few right here, but there's many, many, many more. But it is well established that trees like oaks, especially white oaks, the cherries, the willows, the birches, those tend to be the tree types that harvest the largest number of endemic caterpillars. And caterpillars are kind of that power food that drives everything in the environment. So if you plant oaks, you will get lots of butterflies and moths, and you will get lots of caterpillars. And sure, they're going to eat some of the leaves on these oaks, but you know, these plants and these insects have evolved for so long together that they keep each other in check. It's okay if some of these leaves get eaten. The trees will be fine. But in the process, if you have a tree that is covered in caterpillars, guess what it's going to attract? It's going to attract birds, right? And that's kind of what we want to get to here. For shrubs, the same kind of thing. Anything that has berries on it, service berries, chokeberries, spicebush are great. Blueberries are great too. I have a little row of blueberry bushes that we harvest blueberries from. So not quite the same as the native blueberries, but they're still great for all kinds of pollinators and birds. And as far as wildflowers go, goldenrods and asters are hard to beat. There's so many different insects that rely on goldenrods and asters, and all of those insects will draw in birds again. The nice thing about goldenrods and asters too is that they flower later in the season when most of the birds have already fledged all their young. So right in the time of year when you have, you know, the parent birds as well as the next generation living in your backyard, that's when you need a lot of food to sustain that. So that's a good time to have those kind of flowers around. And often they also keep their seed heads throughout the winter. So other birds that come in the winter will then be able to feed off of those as well. So those are really, really good things. And what you kind of want to do is think about the kind of plants that you plant in your backyard and see them almost as bird feeders. You know, what can you plant that produces insects or that produces berries or both that will feed your birds? Because that's when they will come and look for. And beyond the food aspect, always keep in mind that you want to have cover as well. Birds want to hide. They don't like to be out in the open in the lawn unless they're geese or robins. So it's okay if your yard's a little scrubby and tangly. Birds love that kind of stuff. And if it's really tangly with some woody vegetation, like actual like dense shrubs, they will likely breed in there as well. You would be surprised to see how many birds will survive in your backyard once you start planting these kind of plants. And one thing I would like to point out too, as you can see in this picture too, is that I don't clean up all the dead stems before the winter hits. So whatever is still standing in the fall, I kind of mentioned it before, you know, there's still leftover seed there that birds will eat, but also the stems will be hiding places for little bugs that overwinter in there. So there's always food to be found for birds in the winter when everything is covered in snow. And even if there's nothing in there, it's still, the stems still provide physical cover for these birds so they can hide from the elements and hide from predators. So those are important factors for birds to have and keep in mind as well. So that's sort of the overarching theme. So reduce your lawn, no pesticides, get rid of your invasives, and replace them with natives as much as possible. Now, I wanted to highlight just a few different types of birds so you have an idea of what kind of things they would like so that you can really work on trying to bring those back in. So cardinals, grosbeaks, buntings, like the indigo bunting right there, they like seeds, especially in the spring. So those are the kind of plants that would draw in those kind of birds. But they also like to come to feeders. So if you have a feeder outside, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Filling it with black sunflower seeds is always like a good staple. Those kind of birds, like cardinals and grosbeaks, they will love those kind of seeds. One thing to know about these birds is that they're edge habitat species. So they tend to live in places where the forest ends and there's sort of a field in front of them. So they like to have a view and they like to be in the treetops. So you can have those birds in your yard, but they may not necessarily nest there. If you want them to like really nest in your backyard, you need to have some sort of edge habitat. So if you're somewhere in a city block, probably not going to happen. So it's good to know enough about your birds too, and to know enough about what they need that you can be realistic about what you can actually really create in your backyard. Certain things are just not feasible on an urban lot. And you know, we're about a month away from the first big waves of migrants coming back. So this is a great time to start stocking up your feeders, because just about every day right now I'm hearing and seeing new birds coming back. They're trickling in right now, but pretty soon, towards the end of May, we're just going to have waves of birds coming through. So at that point, you would like to have your feeders up and your suited feeders up, because these hungry birds that just flew in from South America and Central America are going to hit our backyards, and that is the time to see them. Woodpeckers are great. They're really good for the environment. They make use of dead trees. They like to drill holes in there to nest, but they also like to rip the bark off to look for bugs. This is a pileated woodpecker. If you look at the tree that it's on, you see all of the little tunnels that were bored in there. This is an ash tree, and you probably know about emerald ash borer, this Asian invasive forest pest. It's a beetle that lays its eggs on ash trees, and then the larvae will just eat the trees to death, literally. You see it everywhere. It hit like a bomb a few years ago in the Jamestown area, and you just see dead standing ash trees everywhere. It's horrible, of course, and the amount of damage it's doing to our forests is terrible. But woodpeckers right now are coming out on top because they have so many dead trees they can nest in, and they have so many infested trees that have food in them that woodpecker populations are really booming right now. So if you have dead ash trees in your backyard and they're not in a place where they can fall over and hurt you or damage something, just leave them. They're pretty much bird feeders for woodpeckers right now. And you might get pileated woodpeckers like these ones in your backyard too. Hummingbirds are great. They love flowers. They are attracted by reds and oranges and purples. If you've ever had a hummingbird feeder out, you notice that they're usually yellow and red or orange, because those are the colors that attract them. So if you like to have hummingbirds just buzzing around your backyard, you would like to find plants that have those same colors and that provide nectar. But just having other colored flowers outside, your hummingbirds will still come and feed them. Bee balms, bergamots, those kind of flowers, they love that kind of stuff. If you do put out a hummingbird feeder, please don't add any red dye to the sugar water. There's no need for that. If you have a clear feeder and it has a red bottom on it, the bottom is plenty red for the hummingbirds to notice it and be attracted by it. So feeding your hummingbirds unnecessary red dyes is really not recommended at all. Just some sugar and some water will go a long, long way. And you get some other friends in there. You know, I mentioned before the insects that come in when you have flowers out there, but there's some really neat ones. This is the hummingbird moth. It's a daytime flying moth that often gets confused for hummingbirds because they're sizable for moths, but they're even smaller than a hummingbird. And you'll see them buzzing around the same flowers that will attract your hummingbirds as well. Orioles, always great to have. They too are forest edge species, or they like large isolated trees that are surrounded by lower vegetation because they like to hang their nests from those kind of trees out in the open. If you've never seen them, orioles weave together a basket, almost like the size and shape of a sock, woven out of twigs, and they hang it from a skinny branch somewhere. So they like to have trees that have skinny branches that are sort of overhanging or overseeing open areas. So if you have something like that in your backyard, then you may want to put out some feeders to entice the orioles to come stick around long enough that they might actually consider building a nest in your backyard. They don't really have teeth, of course, but orioles seem to have a sweet tooth. They really like food that is high in sugars. I see them on my hummingbird feeders, trying to somehow get a little sip of sugar water from there. But grape jelly feeders, oranges, half oranges just put out on the board near a feeder are great to attract orioles as well. And they're kind of like hummingbirds that they also are very sensitive to the color red. So anything that's red or orange or yellow tends to draw their attention. And there's sparrows. They're often kind of reviled because they're so hard to identify and there's so many of them and so many different ones, and most of them are kind of brown, so they kind of pale in comparison to the hummingbirds and the orioles. But the cool thing about sparrows is that there's so many different species in this area. They rotate out through the year, so you have completely different species of sparrows in your backyard in the winter than you would have in the summer, for example. And sparrows are easy. If you just have some scrubby thickets and you put some seeds on there, if there's some seeds growing on them, or if you have a bird feeder and a deer come knocking them around every once in a while and spill some feed on the ground, sparrows love that kind of stuff. So sparrows are always sort of a guaranteed bird to have around any time of the year. Right now, you probably still have juncos underneath your feeders. That's actually also a type of sparrow. Song sparrows are coming back. You'll get tree sparrows in the winter, but then in the spring, you might get white-throated sparrows or this like white crown sparrow that I have in a picture right here, really exotic-looking ones. Chipping sparrows. There's a whole bunch of different species that sort of rotate through different parts of the year. So, if anything, this is probably one of the easiest groups of birds to attract. If you have some shrubby vegetation somewhere, you will probably get sparrows. And goldfinches too, they seem to go everywhere. One thing to know about goldfinches is that they're one of the last birds to breed in the year, and they line their nests with the fluff that grows on thistles. Now, unfortunately, most of the thistles that we have in our area are non-native ones. They're not necessarily invasive, although some could be. But any kind of thistles, you know, they have the purple flowers early on in the summer, and then by the time they go to seed, they develop that white fluff on the top. And goldfinches actually wait to start building their nest until the thistles have that white fluff out there. And at that point, they will actually pick up the seeds and pick up the fluff, and they line their nest with it. So goldfinches are really late to breed. They also like really small seeds. Of course, they're eating sunflower seeds in this picture right here, but the Niger feed or thistle feed that you sometimes see in the stores, that's the kind of stuff that they really like. So if you put that out for your goldfinches, they might be the only birds that eat that, but they love that really small seed. This time of year, I can still hear them every once in a while in my aspen trees. You can get pine siskins, which is a relative of the goldfinch, and they sometimes come in massive flocks of 50 to 100 at a time. So it's always good to keep your feeders stocked because you never know what might drop in. And of course, the birds that everybody wants are warblers because they're like the holy grail of birds. They're so beautiful and they're so colorful. But like I mentioned before, these are full migrants. They're insectivores, so you cannot really put a feeder out full of bugs. It just doesn't work. So These are birds that are in your backyard, but you probably don't even know about it unless you can recognize their calls. They're hyperactive little bouncy balls that are living in the tops of the trees. They're constantly on the move, catching insects. They don't come to your feeder. So unless you really learn about your birds and learn their calls and figure out what they sound like and where to look for them, you may have several species of warblers already living in your backyard, but you may not even know about it. Depending on the species, they have different requirements. A lot of them live in the treetops. They're always really high up. Several other species like common yellowthroats and yellow warbler, for example, or this chestnut-sided warbler right here, like dense shrubby tangles. They nest in there as well. So if you have a section of your yard that you don't really necessarily want to maintain very well and you just have shrubs growing in there, just let them grow and things will get in there pretty quickly. There's a few little things you can do. I mentioned the feeders already, but there's a few physical things that you can change in your yard that can also help attract birds. Birds need water at all times, and especially during migration when they're flying back from far, far away. Having just a small moving water feature, and the moving part is sort of critical because the way the light reflects on moving water is a cue that birds that are just flying overhead will tune into, and they will stop moving and come down to get a drink of water. So a bird bath with a bubbler that keeps the water moving, a bird bath with a dripper like this one in the picture that just keeps the water just rippling a little bit. Those are the kind of things that, especially during migration, will draw birds in from quite far away. Keep in mind, though, that you do have to keep these bird baths really clean because bacteria will grow in there and they can negatively impact the health of the birds if you have dirty water in there. Food's always good. All kinds of different feeders out there. You can get different types of seeds for different kinds of birds. But if you're not really sure what to do, I usually get black sunflower seed in huge amounts because it's just a good staple that just about everybody eats. And I mix in some sort of songbird mixes or different things. But sometimes I just have black sunflower seed in there, and there's always birds on my feeders. Some birds like platform feeders because they like a surface to sit on. Others like these tube feeders better. So if you can have some variety, that's always a good thing, because you'll also attract a variety of different birds, like these purple finches right here. And there too, keep them clean. It's very important to wash your feeders. Even bleach them every once in a while and then properly dry them. Especially finches like goldfinches and house finches and purple finches like these, they're prone to conjunctivitis, eye infections from dirty feeders. And recently I've been hearing more and more about salmonella being spread onto birds, to the point that in certain parts of the country right now, actually, it's recommended that you don't have your feeders out temporarily just to knock down little salmonella outbreaks. So those things do happen. So you have to be a little bit careful about your feeders and how clean they are. And there are times of the year where you may not want to have your feeders out, because I've experienced it several times. I live right in Jamestown, and 3-4 times a year I have bears walking through my yard. And if the feeders happen to be out at the time, they will take them and run with them. And even if they don't run with them, they will destroy all your nest boxes and feeders pretty quickly. So it's a bit of a calculated risk. Our bear populations are growing pretty hard, so it's hard to avoid it altogether. It totally depends on how bad the winter is and what kind of weather conditions are prevailing. But just keep in mind that there's certainly a risk that you might attract some unwanted attention at times. And boxes. Nest boxes are great too. These two come in different shapes and sizes, and it's really important to just get to know your birds so you know what kind of birds you're trying to attract, because the size of the hole in the box and the size of the box do matter. And there too, the only birds that will nest in nest boxes are what we call secondary cavity nesters. So those are birds that use somebody else's cavity, usually a woodpecker hole or a cavity created by a different bird. They're birds that don't have the ability to create their own cavity but would like to use an available one. So, you know, it ranges from house wrens like this one and bluebirds to wood ducks if you put a box near a pond somewhere. Screech owls and saw-whet owls actually go for wood duck boxes with a larger opening as well. So you can play with that. Try different boxes, different sizes, different openings, put them in different parts of your yard and see what happens. Does it really matter doing all these things, planting these plants and putting all these boxes and such up? I think it does. You know, if you look at monarch populations, for example, they're highly dependent on milkweeds and native plants. And there's a real movement going on to get more of these plants into our environment. And it really directly translates into having more monarchs in our environment as well. And the one thing that often gets forgotten about is that if you look on the left, if you see how shallow lawn grass roots versus native plants and their root masses that go far, far deeper, keeping your yard in place, especially if you have some slopes or places along rivers and creeks where you have erosion taking place, it's most times is because the banks are covered in just lawn grass, and it doesn't keep the soil together. It only keeps the top inch or so together, and it doesn't allow for water to permeate into the soil. We really need a variety of different plants above the ground that create different types and different depth of root masses underneath it to make sure that our soil stays healthy and stays where we want it to be. And there are birds that really benefit from that. Purple martins, common nighthawks, chimney swifts are all birds that are now almost entirely breeding in man-made habitats. So the more of these boxes and different facilities that we put together for these birds, the more we can boost their populations. They're all declining terribly. And if the purple martins, almost 100% of the purple martins that are left alive right now live in man-made boxes. So the more boxes we put up in the right places, the more we can return purple martins back to their environment and restore their population numbers. And we've seen some success stories where we know it works. Osprey, bald eagles, peregrine falcons were all hit tremendously by DDT, and it was on us. We created these problems, but it was also on us that we found a way around it and banned the use of those pesticides, and also created creative solutions to bring these birds back. And the fact that osprey are coming back right now is just a sign that we can do these kind of things. So get to know your birds, know what they need, and then get to know your plants so you can match the two up. And just to give you an idea, I obviously watch birds, and I record my birds that I see in my backyard through eBird, which is an online platform. And you can see in the top, so I've lived in this house here on the edge of Jamestown for almost 8 years now, and I have 152 bird species recorded in my backyard. And I don't have time to garden, and then, like I said, I have lots of invasive still, but I'm trying a little bit at a time to just create some more diversity in the backyard and add some more native plants. So I'm not saying everybody can get 152 species of birds in their backyard, but I think you can get pretty close to that if you put some effort into it. And the one thing I was telling my son about this earlier today too, maybe you already have 150 species of birds in your backyard, but maybe you don't know your birds well enough to actually recognize that. So make it fun. Get to know these birds and figure out what's there. And you might be really surprised to see what shows up in your backyard. So there's a lot of cool stuff to be learned still. There's a lot of important stuff that we're challenged by today. And there's a lot of really great stuff that we can do to help. There's so much more to talk about. There's so much more that we can learn still. And there's so much that we have to learn still. I didn't even know where to begin providing additional resources, but if you haven't read it yet, Doug Tallamy's latest book, Nature's Best Hope, it's a fantastic place to start. I have a copy right here. You may want to check that out sometime. Doug Tallamy is very well known by most gardeners. He's an entomologist. He's really focusing on the insect populations, but he really makes the connection to the value of our backyards in his latest book, and what we can all do to make a difference here. So highly recommend it. The Roger Tory Peterson Institute, we have weekly bird walks and workshops, and we have monthly bird lectures as well that are currently done virtually and hopefully at some point in person again. So if you would like to know more about birds, there's all kinds of resources out there as well. National Audubon Society's website has a lot of valuable information for birdscaping as well. But yeah, come see us at RTPI. We're also opening the Art of the Osprey exhibit on May 15th, which is actually largely focused on the decline of osprey as a result of DDT and all the efforts that have gone into bringing them back. So all kinds of interesting things coming up. And I'm not sure how I'm doing for time here, but hopefully there's still time for questions.
Yes, definitely. Well, thank you so much, Twan. This was fascinating and very insightful, and we so appreciate you returning to the Grow Fair once again, because you're a very popular presenter. Thank you. We have a few questions here. There's a few in the chat. The first here is back to the conversation about shade-grown coffee. Joanne says that she buys fair trade now. How do you find shade-grown coffee, and is it noted on the packaging?
It should be noted on the package, yeah. So ideally you would like to have organic and shade grown, so that it's not just shade grown, but also not grown with pesticides, because it kind of defeats the purpose. Yes, fair trade is absolutely good. I'm not sure if I can name particular sponsors here, but I know Aldi often has really good coffees as well, that are native grown. RTPI, we're currently still closed, but we carry shade grown coffee in our gift shop as well, so that's always
Awesome.
a place to find it.
That's great to know. I didn't know that. Very cool. Camille asks, how does the deer population impact birds?
Do we have another hour? It's not good. I can tell you that. That's sort of the bottom line. Deer, as you undoubtedly know, try to eat just about everything that you're trying to grow in your backyard, and they leave everything that you don't want behind. So multiflora rose, everything with prickers on it, all the invasives tend to be more deer resistant or just grow back faster after they're eaten. So that's a real important conversation we need to have. I know the conversation is being had right now in Jamestown to potentially reduce the size of the deer herd a little bit. We've gotten to the point where deer are comfortable in our backyards, and because of our gardening practices, we've created this buffet right around our houses, right around our homes, that have green things there year round. So again, lawn, you know, there's food, there's ornamentals that are just growing that are in a safe space, because most people don't have hunters in their backyard. Any kind of native predators that deer used to have are mostly gone, and the few that we still have in the area tend to stay away from our yards. So deer have really realized that our yards and our parks and our urban green strips are safe places to be. They can avoid getting hit by cars. And there's always food. There's always food. So we're really creating deer feeders by gardening the way we have been. Changing our vegetation and native plants may change things a little bit, because a lot of these native plants go dormant in the winter, so there will be less vegetation available in the winter months. So, but it's, yeah, there's no easy solution here. You know, the reality will be that if we can remove the food for deer from around our homes, we will have a period where we will see starving deer in the winter, and they will not make it. We just have, but at the same token, we also have so many deer that our environment can't carry it anymore. We're beyond the carrying capacity of our environment. So these deer are doing tremendous damage to our environments. It's almost impossible to fight it, because, like I said, everything you plant gets eaten right away. So it's almost really impossible to break through the cycle. And sadly, the other side effect is that, you know, you have the real risk that you strike one with a car and you get hurt. But in the last few years, the populations have gone up in the Jamestown area. Lyme disease and other tick-borne diseases that weren't really all that common here are really becoming more and more prevalent every year now, primarily because of these out-of-control deer populations. So I'm a biologist. I love animals as much as anybody else, but certain animals just, we're out of whack. The whole system's out of whack right now, and we need to correct it.
It is an interesting conversation. I know I've been following it with the Jamestown City, with the deer population. So
it's hard. It's really hard, and nobody likes to see deer suffer. But the reality, it's almost like it's not that dissimilar from the stray cat situation, where we have too many cats out there, and they're not healthy cats, and we have too many deer out here, and in most cases they're not healthy deer. You know, they're kind of on the edge. If we have a rough winter, we lose a bunch, and we're pretty good, but it's not sustainable. So yeah, either we'll have to bring wolves back into Jamestown, or we have to somehow take care of it ourselves, I guess. But something certainly needs to be done, in my opinion.
Well, I have one more question here, unless anyone else has anything to put in the chat. Mary says, I have a very tall dead tree I need to get taken down this year. If I leave the bottom part still standing, will that help the birds, and how tall would it need to be?
Yes, it would. Yeah, if you can take the top off, and I don't think there's any real good number for that. Whatever you're comfortable with leaving is going to be great, because things will live in there, birds will come and feed on it. Blue jays will hide acorns in it when the wood gets softer, and they'll come back in the winter and try to find it. And if you're driving around town, you see trees sprouting out of dead stumps all the time because of that, because acorns will get stuffed in there by squirrels and jays, and then they forget where they put them, and the next thing you know, you have trees growing on stumps again. So yeah, treat it like a bird feeder.
Great. Well, thank you again, Twan, for your time today. This was fabulous. We appreciate you once again being a part of our event. And we hope that we will have an in-person event in 2022, and we can get back together. But this was wonderful in this world that we're living in right now. So thank you once again for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.